to the third edition of the Night of Ideas in Pakistan, organized jointly by ThinkFest Pakistan, the French Embassy, and the Alliance Française. And our technical support is given from Black Box Sounds in Islamabad. My name is Dr. Mehreen Shida Razvi, and I'm an art historian specializing in Mughal South Asia. And I'm also the deputy curator of the Nasruddin Khalili collection of Islamic arts in London. For those of you who are not familiar, the Night of Ideas it's held once a year by French cultural institutions and partners around the globe to celebrate the stream of ideas between countries, cultures, and generations. This is the 6th year of the programming and the 3rd year that Pakistan has participated. The theme of this year's edition is Closer, or Closing the Distance. And this is an opportunity to reflect on our relationship to space and to others, as well as to our global and personal connections, drawing from the very peculiar times in which we live today because of the COVID-19 pandemic, but also drawing from the past, more importantly. The 3rd edition of the Night of Ideas in Pakistan is an invitation to travel with us to Mughal times. And as I'm sure you're all aware, the Mughals were the Muslim dynastic rulers of South Asia from 1526 to 1858, and their founder, Babur, was of Central Asian Timurid origins. From the reign of Akbar, pictured in yellow in the painting on the right, is when we can really consider this political entity to be an empire. And when this occurred, it gained repute and fame throughout Asia and Europe. Akbar reigned from 1556 to 1605, and it was a period which saw the arrival of diplomatic missions, travelers, missionaries, and others from not only other great Muslim courts, but also from European countries as well. This panel will therefore be a chance for us to reflect on the global connections which were unleashed by the Mughals. And these were connections which were written not only in contemporary historical documentation, but there's also a visual record in the arts and material culture of the period. So for example, in the painting on the left, we see Akbar holding a religious discussion attended by men of different faiths, including 2 Jesuit priests. And they were originally from Portugal. These are the fathers Rodolfo Alcaviva and Francisco Enrique, who were members of a first Jesuit mission to the Mughal court. In the painting on the right, which is this fantastic allegorical painting of Jahangir preferring a Sufi sheikh to kings, we see included in the portrait at the bottom left of the painting, a portrait of the English and Scottish King, James. His portrait was given to Jahangir by the first official English ambassador to the Mughal court, Sir Thomas Roe, and it was then incorporated into the painting, which symbolized Jahangir's supremacy over the spiritual and temporal worlds. Central Asian and Iranian connections were also rife at the Mughal court, and this included the importance of Sufis, both to the early Mughal rulers, but also as an important part of Mughal society on a much broader scale. These paired images of Jahangir being passed a globe topped with the Timurid crown by the deceased founder of the Chishti order, Muinuddin Chishti, really reflects the hereditary importance of these particular ties. This panel will underline how such dialogue cuts across cultures and how it was reflected in Mughal society and the arts, particularly in music and dance. And it draws primarily from the perspectives of illustrious visitors from Central Asia and France to the Mughal court. In a world which is unfortunately marked by rising populism, nationalism, and intolerance, and where COVID-19 has severely constrained domestic and international travel, our aim today is to draw lessons on dialogue and tolerance from the Mughals' pluralistic, syncretic society, which are still relevant today. And with that, it's my pleasure to introduce you to the amazing panel who are going to take you on this journey today. And we have with us Dr. Corinne Lefebvre, who's researcher at the National Center for Scientific Research in Paris. She specializes in early modern Mughal India, and more specifically, she revisits the political and cultural history of the Mughal Empire by reintegrating it into the wider framework of pre-colonial Muslim Asia. We have as well Dr. Jean-Marie Lafont, who is a historian and author. He's the recipient of the very prestigious 2020 Émile Senard Award of the French Academy for his corpus of work on the contributions of the French to the political, military, and cultural life of 18th century India. We have also Dr. Ali Gibran Siddiqui, who is the Leon B. Poyada Associate Research Scholar in Central Asian Studies in the Department of Near Eastern Studies at Princeton University. He is particularly interested in the role of Sufi orders and how they were relevant to trade networks in Central and South Asia. We have as well Arib Azhar, a renowned musician, producer, and writer based in Islamabad. He is a pioneer of performing and interpreting Punjabi Sufi poetry for urban audiences. And he has over 25 years of experience in music and cultural promotion and is a regular speaker on the topic of culture, music, and Sufi poetry in Pakistan. We have as well Khansada Asfandiar Khattak, who is a classical dancer, choreographer, and teacher based in Islamabad. He started learning the classical Indian dance of Kathak in 2001, and he is a renowned performer and has delighted audiences in Afghanistan, Pakistan, and Malaysia. In addition, he's a developmental professional focusing on human rights advocacy, in particular for women and children. And with that, I would like to turn to our first discussant, who is Professor Corinne Lazabra. Corinne, can you please tell us to what extent the history of the Mughal Empire is also a history of travels? And how did contact with various peoples and cultures affect the dynasty's self-identity?
Thank you, Marine, for this wonderful question that is all the more important because the Mughal Empire has long been considered an essentially South Asian phenomenon. But to travel to Mughal times, first of all, means to tell a history of travels, for the dynasty and the polity it founded were the product of multiple circulations through space that operated both at the transregional and regional levels. As you have mentioned, the Mughals were not native of South Asia. They were Turco-Mongols from Central Asia, and it was because they were expelled from their homeland by the rising power of the Uzbeks that they first retreated to Afghanistan and then finally turned their eyes towards Hindustan. However, the ties with Central Asia were not severed once the dynasty founded by Babur became more firmly entrenched in the subcontinent. Until the 18th century, the Mughals continued to attract warriors, Sufis, and literates from Central Asia and to speak Turkish, the language of their ancestors, even though Persian had by that time long become the official language of the empire. And this promotion of Persian is all the more important because it is symptomatic of another layer of transregional circulations that played a crucial role in Mughal state and ideology building. To illustrate this point, let me take two examples. One is the prominent position Iranians gradually achieved within the imperial administration from the second half of the 16th century onwards, and especially during the 17th century. One of the best known figures of this successful Iranian immigration to Mughal India is, of course, the family of Nur Jahan, who became the wife of the fourth emperor Jahangir. The second example I want to bring into the picture is the influence the Safavid dynasty, who ruled over Iran since 1501, had on the religious ideology and policy of the Mughals. On the one hand, the Safavids, who had begun their career as Sufi masters, provided the Mughals with inspiration for their own claims to sacred kingship. On the other hand, Mughal religious openness was, at least in part, fashioned in direct opposition to the Shiite sectarianism of the Safavids. And by way of illustration, I invite you to take a look at this powerful image of the complex relations of imitation and competition that existed between these two major powers of the early modern Islamic world, a complex relationship that is here summarized in the ambivalent embrace of Jahangir and Shah Jahan and Shah Abbas. Sorry. So taken together, this continuous flow of people from Central Asia and Iran towards South Asia certainly endowed the Mughal polity with a fair degree of cosmopolitanism. This was, however, only one facet of the dynamics of empire building. Another equally important process operated at the regional scale of South Asia, and it has to do with the complex and two-way relationship the Mughals established with the land of Hind and its inhabitants. On the one hand, the dynasty significantly transformed the physical and cultural, not to mention the political landscape of early modern India. To start with, Mughal domination impacted the very space of South Asia in multiple ways, among which one may mention the continuous expansion of the agrarian frontier, the creation of new urban centers, or the laying out of their famous gardens. Culturally, the dynasty embarked on a large-scale acculturation of those Indian elites who had willingly submitted to their rule, most notably through the exposition of Rajput warlords to the urban Iranian Islamic court culture and through the personization of Hindu scribes or munshis. Reciprocally, on the other hand, the dynasty's identity, in which Turco-Mongol and Persian elements originally dominated, became even more composite through its encounter with the Indian environment. True, that was not really the case at the initial stages of the conquest. And if you live through the pages of the memoirs of Babur, Hind appears as a land radically alien where everything was different from what he had known in Central Asia and in Afghanistan. And on the next slide, you see, for instance, the visual translation of Babur's description of mango trees, which he discovered with very mixed feelings. However, this sense of complete otherness gradually dissolved under the influence of two major factors. One has to do with realpolitik and the Mughals' growing willingness to not depend on a single elite group as the empire expanded further across the subcontinent. This entailed a process of multi-scale Indianization, the best-known manifestations of which where the matrimonial alliances the dynasty concluded with a number of Rajput clans, and the incorporation of a series of local actors, whether they were Muslim or Hindus, warriors, scholars, or scribes, into the state apparatus. The second related factor I want to stress is the importance the dynasty attached right from the time of Babur to know the territories and peoples they had conquered, because knowledge was, for the Mughals, a key instrument of rule. Much of the information they gathered in the course of their itinerant kingship or through the reports of imperial news writers was, of course, practical in orientation, and it had to do with the material resources provided by the localities. But the Mughals were also keen to gain knowledge of India's past and traditions of kingship in an attempt to bolster their rule at the subcontinental level. This was the primary impetus behind their sponsorship of the translation into Persian of a series of Sanskrit works, such as the great epics of the Mahabharata and the Ramayana. And in a similar spirit, some monarchs, not all of them, also adopted a number of rituals and practices deriving from the various religious traditions present in India, such as sun worship or vegetarianism. To sum up, then, instead of rejecting what they considered the otherness of Hind as something so radically different that it prevented assimilation, the Mughals appropriated it and made it a key component of their identity and claims to universal domination.
Thank you, Corinne. That's absolutely fascinating. And I think there's a lot in there that we can unpack a little bit as well. But before we delve into that a little bit further, can you also just tell us about the Mughal connections outside of this region, so further west into Europe? So, for example, can you tell us any experiences of European and in particular French travelers who were in the region?
Yes, absolutely. But for the sake of time, I think I limit myself to three observations in this regard. One has to do with the sheer diversity of the Western actors involved, even though they have sometimes been portrayed as a kind of a homogeneous mass. Among the earliest ones were the Jesuit missionaries you mentioned, and of which I have also provided a painting on the next slide. But besides these missionaries, you found traders, ambassadors like Thomas Rowe, artisans and artists, doctors, scholars, and of course, soldiers like the French-Swiss Antoine-Louis-Henri Paulier, whom you can see on the left side of this 18th century painting. And while some of these travelers were sent to the lands of the Great Mughal in the context of official missions, others left on their own initiative and for private purposes. Some of them only briefly traveled within the empire's dominions and they had no access to the court, while others met Mughal elites on a regular basis and never came back to Europe. Finally, another key difference between them was their mastery of one of the languages spoken at court, be it Persian, Turkish, Hindavi, or Arabic. My second remark concerns these travelers' changing perceptions of the empire over the 16th, 18th century. Those who came in the course of the 17th century witnessed an empire at the height of its power and influence, with huge armies and massive resources at its disposal. So while a sense of awe therefore pervaded most of the accounts of the time, all travelers did not agree in their assessment of Mughal rule. For some, the despotism of the regime deserved unmitigated condemnation, but others were quite positively impressed by the imperial model of religious pluralism, especially when contrasted with the violent sectarianism prevalent in contemporary Europe. This situation changed dramatically during the 18th century when the empire started fragmenting and a series of regional powers emerged. Although lamentations were occasionally heard, the idea that the time had come to take control of the crumbling giant soon became dominant. And the last point I want to stress is about the key role the Mughals played in the development of Western Orientalism. It was actually through the translation from Sanskrit to Persian, commissioned by the dynasty, that would-be Indologists first gained knowledge of many Hindu philosophical and mystical texts. To take but one example, when François Bernier returned to France in 1669, he brought with him a copy of the Siri Akbar, a Persian translation of the Upanishad that had been commissioned by the Prince Darashuko. And after Bernier's death, the manuscript found its way into the hands of the French Orientalist Anquetil du Perron, who used it as the basis of his own Latin rendition of the Upanishad, a rendition which in turn played a significant role in framing the wisdom of India as part of a universal history of monotheism. So I hope that I've been able to give you an introduction to the diversity of the European presence in the Mughal Empire.
Thank you, Corinne. Absolutely. And if I can just follow up with one question, which kind of ties together all these different uh, themes that you've mentioned, and different types of people and cultures who have been interacting with and at the Mughal courts during this time. And if we center that around these translations that you mentioned from Sanskrit into Persian, it really is very much reflective, if we take that as just a little microcosm reflective of the syncretic nature of the Mughal courts and how open they were to other cultures and to other religions. If you can just speak on that just a little bit as well, please.
Yeah, and too, but if I continue on this topic of translation, it was, let's say, an enterprise with a universal ambition, because side by side with the translation of this text, you know that the Mughals also commissioned the translation into Persian of the lives of Christ, of the apostles, and that all these texts form the basis for the discussion, the religious disputations that were held at the court. And of course, I think it's very important to emphasize the syncretic, the composite culture that came to prevail within the Mughal court. But for all that, we must not push the picture too far and project an ideal picture of this period, because this was also an empire that was built through the use of force, and all these discussions were conducted following the submission of their actors to the temporal and spiritual power of the empire. And there were also voices of dissent, of resistance towards the syncretic culture that the Mughals had built. This could come from a number of Central Asian amirs, but also from the Rajput ranks of the elites, of a number of Indian Muslims ulema, like the well-known Sheikh Ahmad Sirindi. So everything was not as smooth as we like to present it in light of the contemporary circumstances.
Thank you, Corinne, very much for that. And I would now like to delve a bit deeper into the French Mughal connections. And for that, I would like to turn to Dr. Jean-Marie Lafont. So, Jean-Marie, we know that there were very early connections between the Mughal Empire and European countries. And in the case of France, how early would that go?
Well, thank you, Mérine. How early would that go? Very early indeed, since the word Ferengi, meaning a European, comes from the early medieval words of Franks. Under Akbar, we probably had a Bourbon serving the Mughal Empire, and his descendants are still living in Bhopal. Again, during Akbar's period, Pierre-Olivier Malherbe and Vincent Leblanc traveled to India and wrote about their travels. There were several French physicians at the Mughal court. One of them, Saint-Jacques, spent 40 years of his life in India, and he took his Indian son with him when he returned to France. French army men, especially artillerymen, served in the Mughal Empire. And when the famous Venetian traveler Manucci reached Delhi, he happened to meet Claude Maillet in the street, who then hosted him in his house. In fact, there were so many Ferengis in Delhi at that time that the Mohalla near the Kabuli gate was called Ferengipura.
That's so interesting, the sheer number of French individuals who were there. I wonder if you had to pick just one of them to tell us a little bit more about, who would that be?
I would not speak about the well-known ones, like Bernier, whose political analysis of the Mughal Empire still animate rich debate among the historians of Mughal India. Or Tavernier, whose description and drawings of Aurangzeb's diamond are famous the world over. Can we have the first slide, maybe? I would probably select Augustin Iriart, also known as Augustin de Bordeaux, who left France in 1609, reached Lahore in 1612, where he had a house and a family. He died near Goa in 1632.
And do we have any documentation concerning this particular, Franco-Lahori gentleman?
Well, Augustin maintained an extensive correspondence with France, out of which only 4 letters survive. 2 from Lahore, dated 1620, 1 from Lahore, dated 1625, and the last one from Charles near Goa, dated 1632. We also have an interesting mémoire pour les Indes, memory for Indies, sent to Augustin by Fabrid Peresque in 1630, asking many questions concerning the history, archaeology, numismatics, geology, zoology, botany, etc. of India. The memoir is addressed to, I quote, Monsieur Augustin Iriart, and in his absence, to Sieur Louis Iriart, his son, in Lahore, unquote.
It's quite interesting that we have this mention of Augustine's son. And do we know any more about his life or his family, for instance, in Mughal India?
I'm afraid not much more. In his second letter, he says that he married a Hindu lady from whom he had 2 sons. Before his wedding, his mother-in-law and one of his sister-in-law committed sati. And he says he converted his wife and his remaining sister-in-law to Christianity. In his 4th letter, he simply states, I quote, I am going to Goa on business and should return in 2 months' time to fetch my family, my wife and 1 child, who is left to me from the affliction about which I have written to you, probably a pest epidemic, end quote. But Augustin never returned. In the 1920s, a tomb discovered in Agra still bore the following inscription, Jeanne de Iriart, filia, means daughter of Augustine.
That's so fascinating. And do we know anything about what he did or how he lived his life in Mughal India?
Yes, if we move to slide number 3, we have, thank you, we have information about his connection with Jahangir, whom he admired. He worked for the emperor as a military engineer, making, I quote, military machine and a chariot that burns everything it meets, unquote. He also worked as a jeweler. He describes at length the 2 thrones he made for Jahangir and the one he designed for Shah Jahan, maybe the peacock throne. Jahangir mentions Augustin in his Tuzuki Jahangirin, calling him, I quote Jahangir, a Hunormand, or a man who has no rival in the arts of goldsmiths and jewelers, unquote. Augustin was so proud that he even signed 2 of his letters Augustin Warman, the French pronunciation of Hunormand, adding with pride that the emperor gave him, I quote again, his likeness in gold to put on my hat, which is a mark of honor corresponding to the Order of the Holy Spirit in France, unquote. It is clear acknowledgement of Augustine's closeness to Jahangir. By the end of his life, his fortune was secure, although he seems to have had little consideration for Shah Jahan, probably because of the series of murders the new emperor committed in the imperial family for assuring his throne. But his fortune was already secure, and he has a permission to return to France. In 1632, he left for Goa, presumably for some private business, that is what he writes. Unfortunately, he died near Goa, and his trail ends there. His descendants is probably divided today between Pakistan and India.
In the beginning, you mentioned some of the more famous, well-known French travelers, Bernier and Tavernier, and the fact that they do have this legacy associated with them in terms of their relationship with the Mughals. And from everything you've told us about Augustin, it seems that there should also be some sort of legacy associated with him as well. And would you say that that is the case? And if so, what do you think it is?
Well, legacy in India, certainly, because of what 17th century European travelers in India, Bernier, Tavernier, Philippe de la Trinité, wrote about his contribution to the peacock throne. At one time, he was even believed to have been one of the architects of the Taj Mahal, which was not obvious. However, his contribution to the knowledge of India in France has been largely underestimated. In the 4 letters we have, there are short information about the Mughal Empire, about the imperial court, about the judicial system. There is also a brief description of the Hindu society, caste system. His family-in-law was Hindu. His last letter has a gloomy description of Shah Jahan's murders of his brothers and family members when he ascended the throne. But interestingly, we have the mention, I quote from the letter, that the Mohammedans rule the country, but everyone has liberty of conscience, unquote. The copies of Augustine's 4 letters are kept in the papers of Fabry de Peiresc. And we do know that Augustine's correspondence circulated among the various academies in France, including the Academy of the Dupuis brothers in Paris, the Académie Putéane, which became one of the models for the French Academy created in 1635. But copies of 3 of the same letters are also preserved in the archive of Colbert in the Bibliothèque Nationale. Colbert, Louis XIV's minister and the founder of the French East India Company. Would you be surprised if I tell you that before the creation of the Palace of Versailles, young King Louis XIV considered renovating the Louvre Palace in Paris, and this Louvre Palace was to include one Mughal apartment. That was a stillborn project because the king decided to move to Versailles and to build a new palace.
Jean-Marie, thank you. That was so interesting. If I can just ask one follow-up question. What you said about Augustin being given one of the many gold portraits of Jahangir as a mark of his standing at the court. This really exemplifies how much people of any background were embraced, by the court when it suited their purposes. And do you know of any other Frenchmen or other Europeans as well who were given the same distinction? Or would you say that this was something quite peculiar in a good way to Augustin to have that sort of status?
Well, there has been a study about this gold portrait or effigy of Jahangir, it was part of, well, as Augustin says, it was part of kind of similar to a kind of order we had in France, you see. So that was a kind of mystical part also. Augustin was close to Jahangir, close to the friends of Jahangir, people feeling together, discussing together, you see, and having this specific distinction which they were allowed to wear in the public. I just said one word on the last illustration which I have provided, because there is a famous portrait of this Falangi physician from the Rampur Library, which is said to be the only existing portrait of Bernier, which is not so sure, I'm not so sure. But I put it next to Danishman Khan, because Danishman Khan was very famous military commander of Jahangir. He was in charge for a while of the Mughal army, but he was very close to Bernier. And in Delhi, Danishman Khan used to receive in his house Bernier, some Sufis, some Hindu scholars, and they were discussing religion and philosophy. And I give you one funny example, for instance, of this association, because you know the Christian in that time had been calculating through the Bible that the universe was 6,000 years old. While the Hindus were saying, no, million and million of years. And both Bernier and Danishman Khan were laughing at the Hindus who were dreaming so long about the universe, thinking that the European and the Muslim and the Islamic had the real time of the universe. So that was in Danishman Khan's house in New Delhi, in Delhi.
Amazing. It's so fascinating to know that these types of discussions with these different types of people were taking place. Jean-Marie, thank you so much for that. That was wonderful.
Please.
And it's a fantastic...
I apologize for my English.
Oh no, please. Please, not at all. We now move from relationships between Europe and the Mughal court to Central Asia. And we have now Dr. Ali Gibran Siddiqui to speak to us about Khwaja Abdurrahim Jabari and his journey from the court in Bukhara to the Mughal court in Lahore.
Thank you, Marine. So yes, we will be going on a journey with Khwaja Abdurrahim Jabari, a prominent Naqshbandi sheikh of Central Asia. And in doing so, perhaps later on, we will unpack some of the deeper meanings and symbolism behind, what would otherwise seem as a very routine journey across this very varied landscape. So following the news of Prince Khurram's rebellion in the 1620s against his father Jahangir, Khwaja Abdurrahim, who was a prominent visitor at the Uzbek Ashtar Khanid court of Imam Quli Khan, requests that he be sent to India to mediate between two members of the House of Taimur, right? A family, a house, a dynasty that Khwaja Abdurrahim feels that he has a certain responsibility towards on account of the close relationship that, the Naqshbandis enjoyed with the Taimurids historically, even after Babur's move to India in the 1520s, right? And in doing so, he is supported by Imam Quli Khan, because Imam Quli Khan, the ruler of Bukhara, of the Uzbek state in Central Asia, also wants the esteemed Khwaja to put in a good word for him at the Mughal court in India. So this is perhaps a diplomatic, it's very definitely is a diplomatic journey as well, as opposed to perhaps a more personal one, drawing on this older history of this close connection between the Sufi tariqa and the Mughal Timurid family itself. Perhaps prepare for the journey, Khwaja Abdur Rahim Jawabari, who was, one of the richest men in Central Asia, and for us, in our own, with our modern ideas of Sufism, this would seem as perhaps a bit of a contradiction. But we must realize that perhaps the length and breadth and of the varieties of things that we call tariqat or Sufism. This was one way of expressing, these particular Sufi ideas, right, which allowed the Sufi in question here to, have his own business, to be a merchant, to be a diplomat, to be a politician, right? And this is something that we see particularly amongst the tariqa of the Naqshbandis here. And so to prepare for the journey, right, Khwaja Jawabari, he arranges for 30,000 Khani coins. Imam Quli then gives him an additional 100,000 silver tangas, a different kind of coin, and arranges for 9 particularly fast, fleet-footed horses. In addition to this, the goods that the Khwaja carries are quite interesting. They are the pelts of black foxes, Dandone Mahi, right, which would be literally translated as tooth of the fish, but what we understand to be perhaps walrus ivory. Porcelain, fine camels, finer horses, ornately decorated books, and finely illustrated albums from the Uzbek court and the atelier which was attached to it. And on their journey, they pass through Bukhara, right, Balkh, Kabul, and then finally to Lahore, where they are met by, sorry, Mehreen, if you could just switch slides.
Oh.
Where they are received at the court of the Emperor Jahangir. So the painting we have here, we are returning to this. It's Bichitr's masterpiece here. This is not a painting of Khwaja Abdur Rahim Jawabari, but since we do not have any depictions of him, we can understand that he would have dressed similarly according to the descriptions we have of him. And, perhaps unpacking the visual elements behind this painting and the meanings behind those, this trip, this journey, right, it embodied a very Jahangiri approach to Sufism and to Sufis in general. So when Jahangir actually hears news of the Khwaja's arrival, he sends a particularly famous brother-sister duo to receive him. Some of you may have already guessed who these are, but perhaps we can go on to the next slide as well. And this was Asaf Khan and his sister Noor Jahan, right? Noor Jahan, who we know as, the famous empress of the Jahangiri period. And Asaf Khan and Noor Jahan basically pledged themselves to be, murideen of the Khwaja. And they look after every single need of him and his entourage. Eventually, they personally accompany the Khwaja into Jahangir's presence. And the first thing Jahangir does is he steps off his throne and kisses the Khwaja on both cheeks and seats him on his own throne while sitting at his feet, right? The Khwaja gifts Jahangir a particularly spectacular ruby, which, Jahangir holds to his eyes and then sort of like accepts that as, something that's far more than just a ruby. It is something that carries the barakat or the blessings of the Khwaja, right? The Khwaja goes on towards Kashmir because he has heard, these great stories of its gardens and its palisades and its, the great beauty there. And it's Asif Jah once again who arranges for the boat which carries him upriver, up the Chenab. And the boat is described in great detail. It's particularly fancy, if that's a word we can use here. And there's great detail given to the silk shamiana which covers it, right? Which covers the residential quarters where, the Khwaja could sort of like relax as he's in his 50s at this point on his way to Kashmir. Eventually, a little after his arrival, Jahangir passes away. And interestingly, the Khwaja also passes away soon after. And the second half of the Khwaja's journey is not how we would imagine most journeys to be, because the Khwaja is now deceased. But to his murideen and the people of his tariqa and to the entire Mughal court, he is still a source of that barakat. So, and because Prince Khurram is now, the Emperor Shah Jahan, he arranges for his own physician, Hakim Hazip, to accompany the Khwaja and his coffin all the way back to Bukhara, where, every time it stops in a city, the notables of the city come to receive the Khwaja's remains as though the Khwaja were alive in front of them. And I mean, that's pretty much this whole, the account of this very interesting journey of the Khwaja, right? Both in life and in death, to the court of the Mughals and back.
That's absolutely fascinating, Gibran. I was really struck by the fact that you mentioned that when he is on his way to the Mughal court, how we have these two key grandees who hold exceptional, political power at the court. This brother-sister combination of Nur Jahan and Asif Khan, who go to meet him and to bring him back, and even more struck by the fact that Jahangir steps down from his throne to greet him and has the Khwaja sit in the throne, which is, this incredible political space. Why was he treated with such respect, and was this common for other sheikhs as well, or did he hold a particular importance to receive this?
Well, in this case of Khwaja Abdurrahim Juebari, right, we must remember that he is of the Central Asian part of the Naqshbandi tariqa, right? And if you go back to the 15th century, if you go back to the Timurid successors there, we may remember the name of a Khwaja Ubaidullah Ehrar, the peer of the Timurid ruler Abu Said Mirza. And Abu Said was the grandfather of somebody who we are more familiar with, that is Babur, right? In fact, when Babur was born, the azan that was recited in his ear was recited by Khwaja Ubaidullah Ehrar Naqshbandi. In fact, he named him Zahiruddin and then thought about it, and then allegedly, according to some Uzbek sources, gave him the name Babur because he feared that people would completely butcher the pronunciation of Zahiruddin, right? And even though, the Joebaris were a different branch of the same tariqa, right? For the Mughals, they were part of that larger political imagination, right? Where political legitimacy, where political authority was shared with particular peers of the Naqshbandi tariqa, right? Who, using certain key tenets of their worldview, right? Things like khalwat dar anjuman, or the idea that you could be secluded while actively engaging in society, while actively engaging in commerce, while actively engaging in politics. This is something that and the idea was that kingship was shared in this sense, and it's something we see in the the art of Jahangir itself, when Khwaja Moinuddin Chishti is handing him the keys to both worlds, right? We see something very similar with the Naqshbandis, except with the Naqshbandis we see that in person with them. We see this with Khwaja Ehrar, we see this with Khwaja Ehrar's sons and his grandsons. In fact, it's quite possible that the reason that Khwaja Abdurrahim Juebari even came to India, it was possible that it was on the request of another descendant of Khwaja Ubaidullah Ehrar, and perhaps we can also go on to the next slide here. And this is an image, it's not how we imagine Sufis to look like anymore, right? But this is a person in armor, and very peculiar armor. In fact, in other depictions, later copies of the painting itself, the visage, the face of the person depicted here changes, but the armor generally stays the same, especially the very particular knee guards he's wearing, which have faces on them. And this is a picture of Abdullah Khan Feroz Jung Ehrari Naqshbandi, who was, affiliated with the Tariqat, who was a descendant of Khwaja Ehrar, and had fallen foul of Jahangir by rebelling against him several times, but by also massacring people who, Jahangir said, who were his subjects, not those of Abdullah Khan Feroz Jung to wantonly kill, right? And while he's in prison, it's believed that he sent these letters to Abdurrahim Joybari, basically asking him to come over and intercede on his behalf. And while he's depicted in armor here, the written accounts say that when he presented himself in front of the Khwaja, he was dressed in similar robes, with his beard falling down to his chest, and a white turban on his head.
So interesting, thank you. If I could just ask one question, just about the nature of Sufism within, and this might be a very too big a question to answer, so just let me know. But I remember reading, I think it was Niall Green, who basically was talking about this idea that at this period of time we're talking about, when Jahangir is on the throne, and before him Akbar, and as we move into Shah Jahan's reign, that the type of kind of Sunnism being practiced at the Mughal court is actually very much a fusion of Sufism and Sunnism. And so I wonder if just very briefly you could just comment on that.
I would probably not even draw that distinction.
Your thoughts on that.
Right.
Okay.
I mean, I would not perhaps draw that distinction here, because I mean, if you look at Noor Jahan Asif Khan here, right, they are Shia, right, from Iran, right, and yet perhaps in this negotiated space, which is sort of like combining the more sacred shrine spaces with those of a Mughal darbar, right. Certain identities can still be negotiated within that space, so that fluidity does exist. It's not as rigid, and perhaps using, I mean, to be brief here, since we don't have a lot of time, perhaps using certain terminology, certain distinctions, certain ideas of space and identity, which are perhaps more familiar to us in the 21st century, to describe a space in the 17th may not be particularly fair on us and the people who were actually there in the 17th century. So, but yes, I mean, if you sort of look at a certain adherence to a certain quote-unquote orthodoxy, if we are going to make that, that distinction here, then perhaps, Sufis like Khwaja Abdurrahim Joybari, Khwaja Saad before him, Khwaja Abdullah Ehrar, Khwaja Khawan Mahmud, they did see, their presence in the political court as a way of ensuring that rulers behaved like, the rulers of Muslims, basically. Sort of like, checking their behaviors, checking the laws that they are passing, right? Checking their interactions with their subjects. So that is also there. But to sort of like completely, say that like, that is a very Sunni way of doing things, that is perhaps a little anachronistic for us to completely make that distinction there.
Yeah, no, I think that's a very good point. Thank you. And I would like to now turn to Arif Azhar. And Arif, I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about, turning now to kind of the more performative aspects of Mughal culture. I wonder if you can tell us a bit about the Mughal court as a space for intercultural meetings of different types of music.
Absolutely. It's been fascinating listening to all the other speakers. The Mughal times, of course, we have to remember when talking about the Mughal times that Muslims had already been living in the subcontinent side by side for over 300 years, because the first Muslim empire formed was the Delhi Sultanate, although it wasn't as large, of course, nowhere near as large as the Mughal Empire. But that's when this first meeting of these cultures or civilizations took place. And that's when the greatest innovations in music had already happened before the Mughals arrived at the scene, which came as a result of the meeting of these two great traditions of the Indian, Hindu, and other religions, and then the stream of Islam. And that, of course, the first renaissance of music that happened was during the Delhi Sultanate before the Mughals, most notably in the form of Hazrat Amir Khusro, who himself belonged to the Chishtiya order of the Sufis, who was a disciple of Hazrat Nizamuddin Aulia of the Chishtiya order, and who was the greatest musician, considered to be the greatest musician of his times from this land, and who is credited to have invented the musical forms of qawwali, for example, and many rags and scales, and even musical instruments. Some say that he invented the tabla and the sitar instrument, although they were probably invented by some of his students. So this synthesis of culture had already started taking place. What happened when the Mughals came, that it was for the first time that non-Muslims were actually given space as high-ranking notables in the imperial courts. This had not happened before in the Delhi Sultanate. So it was properly during probably the first era of the Mughal times that this synthesis of culture really found its expression patronized by the imperial court, which, of course, if we talk about Akbar as representing as someone representing someone who was totally open to accepting the synthesis of cultures, to the extent that he even presented a new belief system, which he called Deen-e-Ilahi, which was a direct translation of the Hindu Sanatana Dharma, the eternal Dharma. So he took the Hindu mystical traditions connected with the Upanishads and totally saw them as being in harmony with the Sufi or part of the Sufi mystical traditions, probably closer to the Chishtiya understanding of mystical Islam, and which resulted in Deen-e-Ilahi, but of course that didn't really catch on. The music that was performed in the Mughal courts had a lot of influence from Hindu devotional music, which came from Dhurpad or Dhrupad. So the most notable musician of Akbar's court, Mian Tansen, who himself was born of a Hindu family and had a Hindu musical teacher, even though he also is supposed to be influenced by a Sufi sheikh, Muhammad Ghaus. So Tansen was a master of Dhurpad's style of singing. So the courts of the Mughals were very aware of the mystical or the devotional element of music coming from the non-Muslim traditions, and they integrated them within the Muslim traditions. Another example is this theatrical production of what is today we know as the Talisme-Khoshroba, which was this fairy tales, this corpus of fairy tales put together about a mythical Muslim army headed by Amir Hamza with his clever counselor Amar Ayar or Umro Ayar, and they are battling the fairies from the fairy kingdom and trying to convert them to become Muslims and to give up their magic. And Akbar was supposedly very fond of this, so that Talisme-Khoshroba was performed at his court, and huge tapestries were made depicting scenes from these tales, which were used as part of the performance. So the Mughal time was really a flowering of this synthesis. But as Dr. Corinne also said earlier, that we must not forget that there were all sorts of forces at play. So you had a more conservative understanding of Islam, and you had a more conservative understanding of the Hindu belief systems as well. And there were many people who were not happy about this synthesis taking place. So there were many upheavals even within the Mughal court.
Yeah. Thank you. That's really fascinating. You mentioned the musician Tansen, and I wonder if you could just give us a few more details about his role at Akbar's court and the kind of special place he held as one of the so-called 9 jewels.
Yes, so as one of the Navaratnas, Mia Tansen, born of a Hindu family, was an exceptionally gifted vocalist and a musician and a composer. He, during the time of Akbar, he composed several rags that have come from him, most notably Rag Darbari, which is one of the favorite rags from the subcontinent today, is supposed to have been invented, this scale, by Mia Tansen and Mia Ki Malhar, for example. Of all the musical gharanas or the families that exist in Pakistan today, all of the musical gharanas carry stories and legends about Tansen and Amir Khusro earlier. So, for example, some of the stories, a story that I heard from my own teacher about Tansen was about when Akbar one day asked Tansen, he said, "Is there anyone who can sing better than you?" And he said, "Well, now that you mention it, there actually is, and that's my old teacher, Haridas Swami." And Akbar said, "Well, please present him in front of me immediately." And Mia Tansen said, "No, he doesn't come to court. You have to go to him to listen to him." And Akbar, who was always fond of something new, agreed and disguised himself as a commoner and accompanied Mia Tansen to meet his teacher. And they arrived at his house and they knocked at the door and they heard a voice from inside saying, "Who's there?" And Tansen said, "Oh, it's your old disciple Tansen with a very special friend." And he said, "Go away, I don't have time for visitors today." And Akbar became very angry. But Tansen calmed him down and he said, "Wait, I have a way." And he started singing one of the rags that he had been taught by Haridas Swami. And as soon as he started singing that, immediately from inside, his teacher started singing with him. And he said, "No, no, no, this is the way it's supposed to be sung." And when Akbar heard that, he was immediately floored, and he agreed that, yes, he had never heard anything as beautiful. And when they were walking back to the palace, Akbar asked Tansen, he said, "What is it that makes him even better than you? How is it possible?" And Tansen replied to this, he said, "Well, the difference is that I sing at the bidding of my emperor, and he sings at the bidding of his heart." So this is one of the stories that has been passed down, a legendary story. Another wonderful story about Tansen is, of course, how he could invoke elemental forces through the power of his music. So, for example, he could cause storms and rain and thunder to happen. And there's a story about when 2 brothers came to the court of Emperor Akbar, who according to legend are called Chand Khan and Suraj Khan, which Chand and Suraj are, of course, the moon and the sun. And according to legend, they were actually fairies. And they came to the court and they said, "We want to have a musical duel with the court musician Tansen." And they performed first, and they were so great that even Akbar was scared that his court musician would lose this battle. So he asked Tansen, he said, are you up to the task of taking on these musicians, because they seem like immortals? And Tansen said, "Well, give me some time to contemplate." And he went and sat down by the banks of the river Jamna, and in meditation, thinking of all of his musical teachings. And when dawn was breaking, he saw this bird, which was actually a firebird. And the bird had its beak shaped like a flute. And the bird started singing, making this melody. And as soon as the melody would reach the crescendo, the bird's feathers would burst into flames. And Tansen, who was hiding behind a bush, heard this melody and remembered it, and immediately rushed back to Akbar's court And he said, I have the right melody to perform. But before performing it, please put all these candles around this hose of water, but do not light them. And he started singing. And as soon as he started singing, everyone started feeling very hot, because this, of course, was the rag Deepak, the fire rag, which was taught to him by the fire bird, according to legend. And as the song reached its crescendo, suddenly all the candles, the flames were lit. And suddenly Tansen's own clothes burst into flames, so that the legend is that there were these two female singers at court, and they sang Rag Megh, which is the scale which invokes the rain. And when they sang Rag Megh, then Tansen cooled down. So these are some wonderful stories which have been handed down. In all the musical gharanas of Pakistan, you have legends like this about Tansen.
They're absolutely beautiful, and they're so evocative as well. Arif, thank you so much for that. And we now are going to just very quickly hear a little bit about dance, which of course is so integrated with music as well. And so we have Khanzada Asfandiar Khatak, who is going to just waiting for him to come. Welcome, Asfandiar.
Thank you so much.
Can you just tell us very briefly about the history of Kathak and how the dance style changed when it came into contact with different types of Mughal dance traditions?
Sure. Thank you so much for giving me this opportunity. And so Kathak is basically one of the 8 forms of Indian classical dance. And Kathak is the only classical dance form which is from the northern part of India. And northern part was where the darbars were, Delhi and Agra. So Kathak is basically from the Sanskrit word katha, which means story. And Kathak or Kathakar is someone who is the storyteller. So the Kathakars or the Kathaks were actually artists in the northern India who were basically folk artists, and these artists used to amalgamate 3 performing arts, which was music, dance, and drama. And through this art, they used to tell stories moving from one village to another. And so they were very famous because, as you know, folk music and folk dance is also always famous amongst the people. So this was the initiation of Kathak in northern India. Later on, the priests or the pandits from the mandirs or the temples, they invited these Kathakars to come to the mandirs and to perform within the premises of the mandirs or the temples. So here the context and the content of Kathak was changed. So from a folk dance, it became a devotional temple dance. So they were given the stories from Ramayana, stories from Mahabharata, and other mythological Hindu scriptures. Kathak really changed through this time period. So basically the focus from folk was changed to focus on gods and goddesses. Later on, the third stage of Kathak came, and this was because of the influence of the Mughal court. So Mughals, as we know, they were Turkic people, Turkic Mongol people who came from Central Asia, and so they brought in all the traditions of Central Asia and from Afghanistan also. So when the Mughals came, they wanted Kathak as entertainment. They were not very much interested in the mythological stories, so Kathak changed again drastically. But this time there was, change in language also, because the Mughals used to speak Persian and Turkish, so Persian and Urdu was introduced to Kathak, and the dress also changed because in the Hindu Kathak or the traditional Kathak, it's the male costume is like the upper body is bare and lower body is covered with the lungi or with the open cloth. And also the females used to dance in their saris, So when the Mughals came, the angrakha, which I'm wearing, which is also a Central Asian dress, this was introduced, and the dance changed from being a devotional dance to a dance which was more linear and which was more focused on fast movement and pirouettes and spins and pleasing the audience, which was mostly the royalty and the Mughal kings. Thank you.
That's wonderful, Asfandiar. Thank you so much. So we've had this really amazing discussion of cultural connections at the Mughal court. Thank you so much to all our speakers. And I am absolutely delighted to say we're about to have a short performance from Arib and Asfandiar.
Okay, so the first piece that we're going to perform, it's Rag Megh, which is what I mentioned was sung to cool down Tansen when he was singing the fiery Rag Deepak. So this is Rag Megh, which is also supposed to have come from those times. Sa ni sa pa pa ni re re ma pa ni pa ma re ni re sa re ma pa ni re sa ni pa ma re ni re sa गरजत गन चमकत दामनी गरजत गन चमकत दामनी गरजत गन चमकत दामनी गरजत गन चमकत दामनी चलत पुरवाई छना ना 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 गरजत गन चमकत दामनी गरजत गन चमकत दामनी पपीहारा डार डार बोलत पपीहारा शोर शोर कोयल की कूक रे शोर शोर कोयल की कूक रे मन रंग रहे रंगाई चमकत दामनी गरजत गन चमकत दामनी डार शोर शोर कोयल की कूक रे मन रंग रहे रंगाई ओराई गरजत कन चमकत दामनी गरजत कन चमकत दामनी चलत पुरवाई छना ना 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 गरजत कन चमकत दामनी गरजत कन चमकत दामनी गरजत कन चमकत दामनी गरजत कन चमकत दामनी. The second piece we're going to perform is by Bulesha. Bulesha was, of course, also lived during the Mughal times, but had nothing to do with the courts, and was very much of a people's poet, and was also a very controversial poet. Bulesha lived during the time of the Mughal Emperor Aurangzeb, when the Mughals, when there was war between the Sikhs and the Mughals. And when the 9th Sikh Guru, Tegh Bahadur, was executed by the Emperor Aurangzeb, Bulesha from Punjab wrote in one of his couplets that Tegh Bahadur is actually a Ghazi, which is a Muslim warrior, which is a title held for a Muslim warrior. Because of this, he got into trouble. And for many of his other verses, which used to be highly critical of what he saw as the clerical side of religion, and in his verses he used to encourage a direct connection of the human being with the divinity, and he used to always criticize this layer of clergy in between. So he said about himself, he said, "Bhulla ashik hoyo rabda, hui malamat lak, tanu kafir kafir aakh de, tu aho aho aakh." He said, "Bulla, for being a lover of God, were you persecuted? They call you infidel, infidel. Simply say, yes, yes, yes." So this particular song of Bulesha that I'm singing, it's not even certain if it came from him, because many pieces of poetry have been written which have been attributed to him, which are in the same vein, but it does mention his name, so it probably did. And most of his verses were never penned down, so it's part of an oral tradition. So the one I've chosen is one of his more obscure verses, which says, "Neither am I a questioner, savali, and neither am I empty," meaning that I am satisfied. And it says, "Neither am I male or female, neither am I empty nor full, I am content." हो स्वाली हूँ ना खाली हूँ, स्वाली हूँ ना खाली हूँ, आशिक मस्त जलाली हूँ, आशिक मस्त जलाली हूँ, आशिक मस्त जलाली जलाली, आशिक मस्त जलाली हूँ, स्वाली हूँ ना खाली, असा आशिक मस्त जलाली। अल्लाहु अल्लाह, अल्लाहु अल्लाह। नर हूँ ना मादी हूँ, चोर चुगल न फसादी हूँ, नर हूँ ना मादी हूँ, चोर चुगल न फसादी हूँ, आशिक दे इमदादी हूँ, हक आशिक दे इमदादी हूँ, हरामी हूँ ना हलाली हूँ, हरामी हूँ ना हलाली हूँ, स्वाली हूँ ना खाली, हंसा आशिक मस्त जलाली। अल्लाह अल्लाह हक, अल्लाह अल्लाह। खाते हूँ ना पीते हूँ, मरते हूँ ना जीते हूँ, खाते हूँ ना पीते हूँ, मरते हूँ ना जीते हूँ, हुब है दर्दे चलते हूँ, हक हुब है दर विच रहते हूँ, री नशे दे मवाली हूँ, री नशे दे मवाली हूँ, स्वाली हूँ मैं खाली हूँ, स्वाली हूँ ना खाली हूँ, हंसा आशिक मस्त जलाली। अल्लाह अल्लाह हक, अल्लाह अल्लाह। बुल्ला हूँ मैं बेहद हूँ, मौला हूँ न मोहम्मद हूँ, बुल्ला हूँ मैं बेहद हूँ, मौला हूँ न मोहम्मद हूँ, आहद दे विच अहमद हूँ, हक आहद दे विच अहमद हूँ, बुल्लो अल्लाह दी कलाली हूँ, बुल्लो अल्लाह दी कलाली हूँ, स्वाली हूँ ना खाली हूँ, आशिक मस्त जलाली हूँ, आशिक मस्त जलाली हूँ, आशिक मस्त जलाली जलाली, आशिक मस्त जलाली हूँ, स्वाली हूँ ना खाली, हंसा आशिक मस्त जलाली। अल्लाह अल्लाह हक, अल्लाह अल्लाह हक, अल्लाह अल्लाह हक, अल्लाह अल्लाह। Thank you.
Thank you so, so much, Arif and Asfandiar. I just felt like there should have been this burst of applause. And I know, in the studio,
That's the problem with Zoom.
But I mean, it was an amazing, amazing performance. Thank you so much. I feel like I should have saved the word evocative to describe what we've just seen and heard. So thank you so much for that. That was a real pleasure. With that amazing performance, we come to an end of our journey through Mughal times, thanking our amazing contributors, Dr. Corinne Lefebvre, Dr. Jean-Marie Lafont, Dr. Ali Gibran Siddiqui, Arif Azhar, and Khanzada Asfandiar Khatak. Thank you so much for your discussions. Thank you for your performances. And thank you for sharing your enthusiasm for the topic with us all. It's really greatly appreciated. Thank you so much to ThinkFest Pakistan, the French Embassy, and Alliance Française in Pakistan for organizing the event together. It's been a pleasure and a privilege to be a part of it. Thank you to the team at Black Box Sounds in Islamabad for all the tech supports. I hope that we will be able to be together again for next year's next year's event in Pakistan. Hopefully that can be in person. So thank you very much to all the contributors, and thank you very much for your time.